Picture this: March 17, 1948. The Austrian Alps near Salzburg, where American occupation forces maintain control over one of 4 zones carved from Austria by Allied powers after Germany's defeat. Brigadier General Robert Harrison, a 51-year-old logistics officer from Virginia, drives alone up a mountain road toward a secluded hunting lodge that American intelligence has been investigating for suspected black market operations. At 15:34 hours, he radios his aide in Salzburg, confirming arrival at the lodge and estimating 30 minutes for initial inspection. At 15:37 hours, the lodge's caretaker, an elderly Austrian named Franz Kohler, sees General Harrison's jeep pull into the courtyard and watches the general enter the building. At 16:12 hours, when Harrison fails to check in as scheduled, his aide attempts radio contact. There's no response. Search parties arriving within 40 minutes find the jeep untouched, Harrison's personal effects still inside, but the general himself has vanished. The lodge's interior shows no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, just empty rooms and the lingering smell of wood smoke from a fireplace that's still warm. For 77 years, the disappearance of an American general in occupied Austria would remain one of the Cold War's earliest unsolved mysteries, a case that American, British, Soviet, and Austrian authorities all investigated without success. Until 2025, when a massive avalanche tears through the mountain above the lodge, revealing a passage that maps and surveys had missed for 8 decades, leading to chambers beneath the building where General Harrison's final investigation had uncovered secrets that 4 nations had agreed were too dangerous to acknowledge, much less allow one general to expose to public scrutiny. Robert Harrison wasn't supposed to be in Austria. His assignment had been Washington, D.C., where he'd spent 2 years after the war coordinating logistics for American forces being demobilized and redeployed across occupied territories. But in January 1948, he'd been abruptly reassigned to Salzburg as Deputy Commander of Logistics for U.S. Forces Austria, a position that colleagues considered a demotion disguised as a transfer. His personnel file, partially declassified in 2019, revealed that the transfer had been requested by Army Intelligence, which needed an officer with Harrison's particular combination of skills. Logistics expertise, certainly, but also experience with counterintelligence operations and a reputation for discretion that had served him well during wartime assignments involving classified projects. His posting to Austria came during a period of escalating tension between American and Soviet occupation authorities. The country had been divided into 4 zones, with the capital Vienna split among all 4 powers, creating a city where espionage and counter-espionage operations ran constantly as former allies transitioned into Cold War adversaries. American authorities suspected that Soviet intelligence was using Austria as a staging ground for operations throughout Western Europe, and they needed officers who could investigate suspicious activities without creating diplomatic incidents that might trigger conflict. Harrison's letters home to his wife Eleanor, preserved by his family and donated to Army archives in 2003, documented his growing frustration with his assignment. In February 1948, he'd written, "The Austrians are caught between powers that don't trust each other and don't trust them. Everyone's running black market operations because legitimate economy can't function when 4 different currencies and 4 different regulations apply depending on which zone you're in. My job is supposed to be tracking military supplies to prevent theft and sale to civilian markets. But what I'm actually doing is investigating facilities that intelligence suspects are being used for purposes nobody will explain to me clearly." His final letter, mailed on March 15th, just 2 days before his disappearance, contained observations that Eleanor would read and reread for decades, searching for meaning that remained elusive. "I've been ordered to inspect a hunting lodge in the mountains. Intelligence says it's being used for black market operations, but the briefing I received felt incomplete, like they were telling me just enough to justify the mission without revealing why they really care about this particular location. The lodge belonged to a Nazi official during the war, was confiscated by occupation authorities, and supposedly sits empty except for a caretaker. But satellite reconnaissance, which we're just starting to use, shows heat signatures suggesting occupied spaces that architectural surveys don't account for. I'm going up there Monday to look around. If I find anything significant, I'll report to intelligence directly rather than through normal channels. Something about this assignment feels wrong, Eleanor. Like I'm being sent to confirm something specific rather than conduct a genuine investigation. The hunting lodge Harrison had been assigned to inspect had a history that intelligence files documented extensively but incompletely. Built in 1936 by an Austrian industrialist with Nazi connections, it had been used during the war as a retreat for high-ranking SS officers who wanted privacy for meetings that even other Nazi officials weren't cleared to attend. After German surrender in May 1945, American forces had searched the lodge as part of systematic efforts to locate war criminals and seize assets. They'd found nothing unusual, just a well-appointed hunting lodge with expensive furnishings and extensive wine cellars. The lodge had been placed under occupation authority control. Its caretaker, Franz Kohler, kept on staff to maintain the property, and it had sat essentially unused for 3 years. But in late 1947, American counterintelligence had received reports from multiple sources suggesting the lodge was being used for unauthorized activities. Austrian civilians living in nearby villages reported seeing vehicles approaching the lodge at odd hours, despite no official visits being scheduled. Local hunters claimed to hear machinery operating inside the building, sounds that didn't match any legitimate use of a hunting lodge. And most intriguingly, Soviet intelligence officers had been observed in the area multiple times, conducting their own surveillance of the lodge from positions in the surrounding forest. The assignment to inspect the lodge had been given to Harrison specifically rather than to standard military police units that normally handled such investigations. Intelligence officials had briefed him privately, emphasizing that this was a sensitive matter requiring an officer who understood the political implications of whatever he might find. If the lodge was being used for black market operations involving American soldiers, that needed to be documented and prosecuted quietly to avoid public scandal. If it was being used by Soviet agents for intelligence gathering or sabotage preparations, that needed to be reported through channels that wouldn't trigger diplomatic crisis. And if, as some intelligence analysts suspected, it was being used by former Nazis who'd escaped prosecution and were attempting to rebuild underground networks that required careful handling to avoid interfering with ongoing investigations into war criminals. Harrison had driven to the lodge alone on March 17th, following orders that emphasized discretion over security. His Jeep carried standard equipment, a radio, sidearm, and documents authorizing him to inspect any American-controlled property in the occupation zone. The mountain road leading to the lodge was rough but passable, winding through forests still heavy with winter snow, climbing into elevations where spring hadn't yet arrived despite calendar dates suggesting otherwise. Franz Kohler, the caretaker who'd watched Harrison arrive, would be interviewed extensively after the general's disappearance. His testimony, given to American military police and documented in reports that remained classified until 2018, described a brief interaction that seemed routine but which later analysis suggested contained significant details. Harrison had entered the lodge, asked Kohler about recent visitors and maintenance activities, and then requested to inspect the cellars and storage areas. Kohler had provided keys and offered to accompany the general, but Harrison had declined, saying he preferred to conduct his inspection alone to avoid any appearance of the caretaker influencing what he reported. According to Kohler's testimony, Harrison had descended to the cellars around 1540 hours, and Kohler had returned to his quarters in a separate building on the property. Approximately 30 minutes later, around 1610 hours, Kohler had heard what sounded like a vehicle starting, but when he'd looked out his window, Harrison's Jeep was still parked where he'd left it. Kohler had assumed the sound came from the valley below, where farms and small villages sometimes generated noise that echoed through the mountains in ways that made distance difficult to judge. When American military police arrived at 1650 hours, responding to Harrison's failure to check in, they'd found Kohler confused but cooperative. He'd shown them through the lodge, which appeared exactly as it should, a well-maintained but largely unused hunting retreat with no signs of occupancy beyond Kohler's own presence. Harrison's personal effects were in his Jeep. His briefcase containing inspection documents sat on the lodge's main table where he'd apparently placed it before descending to the cellars. But the general himself was nowhere to be found. The cellar inspection revealed nothing unusual. Standard storage spaces, wine racks mostly empty since the war had ended, electrical systems consistent with a building of this type and age. No hidden rooms, no concealed passages, no evidence of recent occupation or unauthorized use. Military police and intelligence specialists would conduct 3 more detailed searches over the following weeks, each progressively more invasive, eventually bringing in engineers to examine the building's structure for any spaces that might have been missed. They found nothing that explained Harrison's disappearance. The investigation expanded beyond the lodge to consider alternative explanations. Had Harrison left voluntarily, perhaps defecting to Soviet intelligence or fleeing for personal reasons? His financial records showed no irregularities. His personal life was stable, and he had no history of sympathizing with communist ideology. Had he been abducted by Soviet agents or former Nazis seeking revenge for his wartime activities? Extensive intelligence gathering found no evidence of Soviet operations in the area that day, and former Nazis being tracked by Allied authorities all had verifiable alibis for the time of Harrison's disappearance. The official investigation concluded in June 1948 with a report that satisfied no one. General Harrison had disappeared under circumstances that suggested neither voluntary departure nor conventional kidnapping. The most likely explanation, investigators reluctantly concluded, was that he'd left the lodge through an exit not discovered during searches, encountered some accident or attack in the surrounding mountains, and his body had been concealed by terrain or weather. Search parties combed the area for weeks, finding nothing. Harrison's family was notified that he was missing and presumed dead, though his body hadn't been recovered. And the case was closed, filed away as another unsolved mystery from occupation's chaotic early years when jurisdictions were unclear and intelligence operations often operated outside normal oversight. But the investigation's classified annexes, released partially in 2020 and more completely in 2024, revealed that American intelligence hadn't truly closed the case. They'd continued monitoring the lodge, conducting periodic inspections, and investigating any reports of unusual activity. And they'd reached a conclusion they never publicly acknowledged. Harrison had found something in that lodge, something significant enough that his discovery had triggered response from parties unknown, resulting in his disappearance in ways that suggested capabilities beyond what Soviet intelligence or Nazi remnants should have possessed. For 77 years, the hunting lodge sat in the Austrian mountains, passing through various owners as occupation ended and Austria regained independence. The property changed hands multiple times, used briefly as a private retreat, a small hotel, and eventually abandoned again as mountain tourism shifted to more accessible locations with better infrastructure. By 2020, the lodge was derelict, its roof collapsing, its windows broken, scheduled for demolition once environmental surveys confirmed the site could be cleared safely. On January 23, 2025, an avalanche struck the mountain above the lodge with unprecedented force, a consequence of climate change creating unstable snowpack and unseasonable warming that triggered massive releases. The avalanche destroyed what remained of the lodge's structure, but it also revealed something that 7 decades of searches had missed. The mountain face behind where the lodge had stood was torn away, exposing rock formations that geological surveys insisted shouldn't exist at this location. And within those formations was an entrance, deliberately concealed but now exposed by forces of nature that no human planning could have anticipated. Austrian authorities investigating the avalanche's aftermath discovered the entrance on February 3, 2025, and immediately notified both Austrian intelligence and American military attachés who maintained liaison relationships dating from occupation years. What that entrance led to would finally answer questions about General Robert Harrison's disappearance and reveal why a hunting lodge in the Austrian mountains had mattered enough in 1948 that a general's investigation of it had resulted in his vanishing from history for 77 years. The passage revealed by the avalanche descended 40 meters into the mountain, carved through solid rock with precision that suggested professional engineering rather than natural cave formation. Austrian mountain rescue teams, experienced with alpine cave systems, immediately recognized that this wasn't a natural geological feature. The walls showed tool marks consistent with mid-20th century drilling and blasting techniques. The passage had been deliberately created, deliberately concealed, and maintained in condition that suggested it had been accessed repeatedly over decades, despite official records insisting the mountain contained no such structure. The first exploration team entered on February 8, 2025, equipped with modern climbing gear and communication equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to General Harrison in 1948. What they found at the passage's terminus was a steel door, Wehrmacht gray, bearing serial numbers that military historians would later identify as consistent with 1944 German military construction. The door wasn't locked. Its mechanism, though corroded by 77 years of mountain moisture, yielded to careful manipulation, and beyond it lay chambers that explained everything about Harrison's disappearance and why 4 nations had apparently agreed to keep what happened to him secret. The first chamber was an office, preserved by the sealed environment in remarkable condition. Furniture remained upright, papers sat on desks, and most significantly, a U.S. Army briefcase leaned against one wall, its leather cracked but intact, bearing stenciled identification. B.G. Robert Harrison, U.S. Forces, Austria. The investigation team photographed everything before touching anything, documenting a scene that had remained frozen since March 1948, when a general had entered and never emerged. Harrison's briefcase contained his inspection documents, notes he'd made during his drive to the lodge, and a journal he'd apparently started keeping after discovering the passage. The journal's first entry was dated March 17, 1948, at 15:45 hours, just minutes after he'd entered the lodge. Discovered concealed entrance in wine cellar behind movable rack, stairs descending into mountain. Kohler claims ignorance, but his reaction when I mentioned the cellar suggested he knows more than he's admitting. I'm proceeding alone to document whatever this leads to before reporting. If it's simply black market storage, I'll file standard report. If it's something more significant, I need to understand what I'm dealing with before involving higher command. The subsequent entries documented Harrison's descent into the passage and his discovery of what lay beyond. 16:05 hours. I've found a facility, not a cave. A deliberately constructed underground complex, multiple chambers connected by corridors, electrical systems still functional, powered by what appears to be geothermal generation. The construction quality suggests German military engineering, but the equipment inside doesn't match anything in my briefings about Nazi installations in Austria. I'm continuing deeper. The complex appears to extend farther than surface surveys of this mountain would suggest is possible. Harrison's journal revealed that he'd spent hours exploring the facility on March 17th, discovering chamber after chamber filled with equipment, documents, and materials that he couldn't immediately identify. 1,742 hours. I've found what appears to be a research laboratory, equipment for chemical analysis, spectrography, materials testing, but also devices I don't recognize, instruments whose purpose isn't clear from visual inspection. The documentation is primarily in German, but also Russian, English, and what might be Norwegian or Swedish. This wasn't a purely German facility. It was multinational. The journal's tone shifted as Harrison made discoveries that challenged his understanding of what he'd been sent to investigate. 1,853 hours. I've been underground 4 hours. Should have checked in an hour ago, but what I'm finding here requires more time to document properly. This facility wasn't built for black market operations. It wasn't built for conventional military purposes. The documents I'm finding reference something called Project Zeitgeist, Time Spirit, a research program initiated in 1943 by scientists from multiple nations who believed their work was too important to be constrained by national loyalties or wartime politics. Harrison's journal entries became increasingly detailed as he documented his discoveries throughout the evening of March 17th and into the early morning of March 18th. He'd found evidence that Project Zeitgeist had been researching advanced physics, specifically theories about time, space, and consciousness that conventional science in 1948 considered speculative at best. The project had involved German scientists, certainly, but also researchers from Allied nations who'd been reported killed or captured during the war, but who'd apparently faked their deaths to continue work they believed transcended the conflict. But the journal also documented Harrison's growing realization that he'd stumbled into something more complex than unauthorized scientific research. March 18th, 0247 hours. I've been down here 12 hours. I should leave, report what I've found, let intelligence decide how to handle this. But I keep finding more, and each discovery changes my understanding of what this facility represents. The scientists working here weren't just conducting research. They were preserving knowledge, creating archives of scientific understanding that would survive regardless of which side won the war or what happened to civilization in the atomic age everyone fears is coming. The journal revealed that Harrison had eventually encountered someone in the facility. Not a threat, but a representative of whatever organization was maintaining Project Zeitgeist's operations. March 18th, 0534 hours. I've met Dr. Elena Volkov, a physicist who speaks fluent English with Russian accent. She claims to represent what she calls the Continuity Commission, an international organization that oversees scientific research projects that multiple governments have agreed should operate outside normal national jurisdiction. She's offered to explain Project Zeitgeist's purpose and to present me with options regarding what I do with what I've discovered. Harrison's subsequent journal entries documented conversations with Dr. Volkov that lasted through March 18th and into March 19th. She'd explained that Project Zeitgeist was one of several research initiatives that had been established during World War II by scientists who recognized that advancing knowledge in certain fields required cooperation that national conflicts made impossible through official channels. The projects operated with the knowledge of intelligence services from multiple nations, all of whom had agreed that allowing the research to continue under observation was preferable to either seizing it for exclusive national use or destroying knowledge that might prove crucial to humanity's survival. But Dr. Volkov had also explained the price of this arrangement. The projects could only function if their existence remained secret, if governments could deny knowledge of their operations, and if no single nation could claim authority over them. Observers were occasionally assigned to the projects, intelligence officers like Harrison who'd discovered them accidentally or been sent to investigate, but who'd been convinced that their mission required remaining involved rather than simply reporting and withdrawing. Harrison's journal documented his internal struggle with this revelation. March 19th, 11:47 hours. Dr. Volkov has given me 48 hours to decide. I can leave, report finding an abandoned German facility with no current occupants, file a standard inspection report, and return to my normal duties. Or I can remain here as American observer, understanding Project Zeitgeist's work, ensuring it poses no security threat, and serving as liaison between the project and U.S. intelligence through channels that protect both the research and my superiors from political complications if the arrangement becomes publicly known. The journal's final entries revealed Harrison's decision. March 21st, 0623 hours. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or threatened, because I've seen what these scientists are working toward, and I believe it's too important to be monopolized by any nation or destroyed by fear of its implications. They're not building weapons. They're building knowledge, creating understanding that could help humanity survive the next war if we're foolish enough to fight one. My family will be told I'm missing. My career is over, but perhaps some sacrifices are worth making for purposes that transcend individual ambition or national loyalty. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Harrison had indeed lived in the facility for years after his reported disappearance. Personal quarters showing signs of long-term occupation, letters to his wife Eleanor that had been written but never mailed, documenting his life underground and his growing acceptance that he'd made an irrevocable choice, and a second journal covering the period from 1948 to 1953, revealing that Harrison had served as American observer to Project Zeitgeist until the facility was closed and operations moved to a new location that he wasn't told about. This second journal documented Harrison's complex relationship with his role, pride in serving a purpose he considered worthy, loneliness from isolation and inability to contact family, frustration with intelligence handlers who communicated through dead drops and encrypted messages but who never acknowledged his existence officially, and ultimately acceptance that some choices, however justified, carried personal costs that couldn't be mitigated by belief in greater good. The journal's final entry, dated August 17, 1953, revealed Harrison's fate. Project Zeitgeist is closing this facility, consolidating operations elsewhere. I'm being relocated to South America under new identity, with pension and support provided by funds that officially don't exist. I'll live out my remaining years as Jorge Ramirez, Argentine businessman with no history before 1953. Eleanor will never know I survived. My children will grow up believing their father died investigating black market operations in occupied Austria. But I've helped protect knowledge that might save civilization if we survive long enough to use it wisely. That has to be enough. The investigation team found one more document in Harrison's quarters, a sealed envelope addressed to whoever eventually discovered the facility. Inside was a letter Harrison had written in 1953, anticipating that someday, perhaps decades later, someone would find the passage and want to understand what had happened here. The letter explained Project Zeitgeist's purpose, justified Harrison's decision to join it, and provided contacts for organizations that could verify his account if anyone with sufficient security clearance wanted to investigate further. But the letter also contained a warning. If you're reading this, you've found a facility that multiple governments agreed should remain secret. Before you decide what to do with this discovery, understand that some knowledge is protected not because it's dangerous, but because it's too valuable to be monopolized. The work done here contributed to scientific advances that all nations eventually benefited from. The scientists who worked here did so believing that human knowledge transcends political boundaries. Whether you agree with that principle, whether you think the arrangements made to protect this work were justified, those are judgments I can't make for you. I can only tell you that I gave up my identity and my family to help preserve something I believed was worth that price. The Austrian government's response to the facility's discovery was immediate and comprehensive. The site was sealed, contents were cataloged under the highest security classifications, and diplomatic consultations were held with American, British, Russian, and German governments about how to handle evidence of arrangements made during occupation years that none had publicly acknowledged. Eventually, a consensus emerged that mirrored decisions made 77 years earlier. The facility's existence would be acknowledged as a German military installation from World War II. Its contents would be described as historical artifacts of no current significance. And the truth about Project Zeitgeist, about Harrison's fate, and about the international scientific cooperation that had existed secretly throughout the Cold War would remain classified with no timeline for public release. But Harrison's family was contacted, given partial truth that military authorities had determined was both deserved and safe to reveal. In June 2025, Harrison's granddaughter Emily, who'd spent her life knowing her grandfather only through photographs and stories about his mysterious disappearance, received notification from the U.S. Army. General Harrison had indeed disappeared in 1948, but not through kidnapping or accident. He'd discovered a classified facility, had remained to serve as observer under circumstances that required his official death, and had lived until 1971 under assumed identity in Argentina, where he'd died of natural causes at age 74. Emily was given access to some of Harrison's letters, the ones he'd written to Eleanor but never sent, documenting his life in exile and his enduring love for the family he'd abandoned for reasons he believed justified his sacrifice. She was also shown the letter he'd left in the facility, explaining his choices to whoever eventually discovered them. And she was told, in language carefully crafted to reveal truth without compromising security, that her grandfather had served purposes that transcended his official military career, that his sacrifice had contributed to scientific cooperation that benefited all nations, and that he'd never stopped regretting the pain his choice had caused his family even as he remained convinced it had been necessary. The hunting lodge, what remained of it after the avalanche, was demolished completely in September 2025. The passage into the mountain was sealed with concrete and steel, its entrance concealed so thoroughly that future avalanches would find nothing to reveal. A small memorial was installed nearby, acknowledging that Brigadier General Robert Harrison, U.S. Army, had disappeared at this location in 1948, and that he'd given his life in service to ideals that military authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. But among those few who knew the complete truth, who'd read Harrison's journals and understood what Project Zeitgeist represented, there was quiet acknowledgement that history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that the Cold War had involved not just military and political conflict, but scientific competition that sometimes transcended those conflicts, that some individuals had made sacrifices that would never be fully recognized because the purposes they'd served remained classified, and that the hunting lodge in the Austrian mountains, seemingly insignificant, had been one node in a network of facilities where knowledge was preserved and protected by people who believed that human progress required cooperation, that politics made difficult but not impossible. General Robert Harrison had walked into that lodge in March 1948 and vanished into a world where national loyalty gave way to ideals that transcended borders. He'd spent 5 years underground protecting research that multiple nations wanted, but none could safely control alone. And he'd emerged into anonymous existence in South America, carrying secrets that would remain buried for 77 years before being partially revealed to a world that still struggled to understand why some knowledge required protection from both those who would monopolize it and those who would destroy it rather than allow others to possess it. The dark secrets revealed in the Austrian lodge weren't crimes, but compromises. Not betrayals, but sacrifices made by individuals who believed that preserving human knowledge required commitments that transcended conventional loyalty. Whether those commitments were justified, whether the arrangements made to protect Project Zeitgeist were ethical, those remained questions that authorities hoped would never need public answers. But for Emily Harrison and others who learned partial truths about their missing relatives, there was at least understanding that sacrifice had meant something, that disappearance had served purpose, and that sometimes the greatest service involved giving up everything, including recognition, to protect principles that no single nation owned but all humanity benefited from preserving. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.